Margaret Holloway had lived in the same house for over 50 years. A quaint white cottage with blue shutters nestled at the edge of town. It wasn't as fancy as the newer houses popping up nearby, but it had something those homes lacked: history. It had witnessed laughter, sorrow, and generations passing through its creaky wooden floors. At 78, Margaret was the last of the Holloways still living there. Her husband, Richard, had passed a decade ago, and her 2 children had moved out long before that. She had adjusted to the quiet, filling her days with gardening, knitting, and watching the neighborhood from her front porch. But tonight, the quiet was broken. A rustling noise came from her backyard. Margaret had always been a light sleeper, a habit formed from decades of motherhood and later widowhood. She sat up in bed, straining her ears. The noise wasn't the wind. No, this was different: footsteps. She slid out of bed, slipped on her robe, and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from her nightstand. She kept it there for power outages, but tonight it would serve a different purpose. Moving carefully, she made her way to the back door, her heart thudding with a mix of fear and determination. She wasn't one to let trespassers roam her yard unchecked. Peering through the window, she saw 4 shadowy figures crouched near her vegetable garden. Boys, young ones, maybe teenagers. Margaret clenched her jaw. Thieves? Her garden was her pride and joy. It took her hours of work every day to maintain those tomatoes, cucumbers, and strawberries. And now, these kids thought they could help themselves in the dead of night? Not on her watch. She swung open the back door, the hinges creaking loudly in the night. The boys froze. Hey! Margaret's voice was stronger than she expected. What do you think you're doing? One of the boys gasped, dropping something. Was that a shovel? Another took a step back, glancing at his friends. They were caught, and they knew it. Margaret lifted the flashlight and shone it directly at them. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing 4 teenage boys with guilty faces. None of them spoke. What are you stealing? Margaret demanded, stepping closer. Speak up. The tallest of the group, a lanky kid with dark hair, swallowed hard. We're not stealing, ma'am. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Then what are you doing? The boy hesitated, then glanced at his friends. Finally, he muttered, We're digging. Margaret's stomach turned. Digging? What could they possibly be digging for? She stepped closer, directing the flashlight beam downward. The moment she saw what they had been working on, her breath hitched and the blood drained from her face. She turned pale. Margaret's knees wobbled as she gripped the doorframe for support. Her flashlight's beam trembled slightly as it illuminated the gaping hole in her yard. It wasn't just a small patch of dirt disturbed by mischief. This was deliberate. Deep. Almost 3 feet down. She swallowed hard. Why are you digging here? Her voice was a whisper now, not the stern bark it had been a moment ago. The boys exchanged glances, unsure of how to answer. The one who had spoken before, she could now see his face more clearly, wasn't much older than 16. He shifted uncomfortably under her piercing gaze. Look, ma'am, he said, rubbing his hands together nervously. We didn't mean to scare you. But we have to finish. Margaret's breath hitched. Finish what? The youngest of the group, a freckle-faced boy with round glasses, suddenly piped up. We're looking for something buried here. Margaret's stomach twisted. She took another step forward, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. You listen here, she said, her voice regaining its strength. This is my property, and I'll have the police over here in 2 minutes if you don't explain yourselves. Wait. The tallest boy put his hands up in surrender. Please, just let us explain. We're not criminals, I swear. Margaret hesitated. She was no fool. She knew the difference between neighborhood pranksters and something more sinister. These boys weren't trying to rob her. They weren't even trying to run. If anything, they looked desperate. Talk, she said, crossing her arms. The tall boy took a deep breath. My name's Ryan. This is Jason, Luke, and Ben. He gestured to the others, who nodded awkwardly. We've been researching old maps of this town, and we think something valuable is buried here. Margaret's frown deepened. Valuable? Jason, the boy with glasses, adjusted them nervously. Yes, ma'am. A time capsule. Margaret blinked. A time capsule? She didn't know what she had expected them to say: buried treasure, a lost pet, something illegal, but this was surprising. Explain, she said, still suspicious. Ryan licked his lips and continued. Back in the 1940s, when this land was still part of an old farm, there was a group of kids, teenagers like us, who buried a time capsule in one of their yards. But the town expanded and their houses were torn down or remodeled. The only thing that remained the same was your yard. If our research is right, the capsule should be here. Margaret's grip on the flashlight tightened. 1940s. Her childhood. She tried to steady her thoughts. Could it be possible? She had lived in this house for over 5 decades, but before that it had belonged to another family. A family with children. Memories surfaced, blurry and half-forgotten. She had heard stories, whispers from old neighbors who had since passed. Something about a wartime project. A keepsake hidden away for the future. Margaret's heart pounded. Could it be real? She swallowed, forcing herself to focus on the boys in front of her. And you think it's here? Ryan nodded quickly. We've looked through the records. Old property maps. Newspaper archives. Everything points to this spot. Margaret looked down at the hole they had already dug. It was dangerously close to her beloved tomato plants, but there was something else, something unsettling about the whole situation. She exhaled sharply. I should call the police on you for trespassing. Ben, the quietest of the boys, finally spoke up. Please don't, he said softly. We just wanted to find it. To see history. Margaret stared at them for a long moment, weighing her options. Then, after a long pause, she did something that surprised even herself. She grabbed a shovel. Well, she said, looking at the stunned boys. Are we digging or not? The boys stared at Margaret in stunned silence. You're going to help us? Ryan stammered. Margaret huffed, gripping the handle of the shovel tighter. I'm not saying I believe you, but if there's something buried in my yard, I want to know what it is. She pointed a wrinkled finger at them. But let's get one thing straight, if I find out you boys are lying or up to no good, I'll be calling the police faster than you can say time capsule. The boys nodded frantically, clearly relieved. With a sigh, Margaret stepped forward, positioning herself at the edge of the hole they had started digging. Her old bones protested, but she ignored the ache. She had spent her whole life working this land. What was a little more effort? Where exactly do you think this thing is? She asked. Jason, the one with glasses, pulled a folded, weathered paper from his hoodie pocket. Based on the old maps, it should be about 4 feet deep, near the center of your yard, probably inside a metal container. Margaret eyed him. And you're sure about this? Jason hesitated. I mean, mostly. Margaret sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she jammed the shovel into the dirt, scooping up a heavy pile and tossing it aside. The boys followed her lead, each grabbing their tools and digging with renewed energy. Minutes turned into an hour. The hole deepened. Margaret's muscles burned, but she refused to stop. Something inside her, the same stubbornness that had kept her independent all these years, drove her forward. Then Ben's shovel hit something solid. Clank. Everyone froze. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. That didn't sound like a rock. Ben knelt, brushing the dirt away with his hands. Slowly, a rusted metal corner peeked through the soil. Jason gasped. It's real. It's actually real? Margaret's heart pounded. A part of her had believed this was a fool's errand, just kids chasing some urban legend. But this was something tangible. Ben and Ryan worked together to dig around the object, revealing an old, rusted metal box about the size of a large toolbox. It was caked in dirt, its surface corroded with time, but the lid was still intact. Margaret felt a strange sense of déjà vu looking at it. A memory, faint and distant, flickered at the edge of her mind. But she couldn't quite grasp it. Ryan reached for the box, but Margaret grabbed his wrist. Wait, she said sharply. Let me. The boys exchanged glances but stepped back. Margaret crouched, her old knees protesting. With trembling hands, she brushed more dirt away, then pried at the lid. It didn't budge at first, but after a few tugs, it gave way with a loud creak. Inside, bundled in old, yellowed newspaper, were several small objects. Margaret's fingers hovered over them, her heart racing. A child's leather-bound journal. A rusted pocket watch. A bundle of letters tied together with a fraying red ribbon. She inhaled sharply. This wasn't just some random time capsule. This was a piece of someone's life. Her fingers shook as she reached for the journal, flipping it open. Faded ink filled the pages, the handwriting careful and neat. And then she saw the name written inside the cover. Her breath hitched. The boys noticed her pale face. What is it? Jason asked hesitantly. Margaret swallowed hard, the world spinning around her. The name in the journal belonged to someone she hadn't thought about in over 60 years. Someone she had once loved. Someone she had lost. Her childhood sweetheart. James Whitmore. Margaret's hands trembled as she traced the name inside the journal. James Whitmore. She whispered it under her breath, barely believing what she was seeing. The boys exchanged nervous glances. Ryan stepped forward cautiously. Ma'am? Are you okay? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her mind had been thrown backward, past the decades, past the loss, back to a time when she was just a girl, standing in this same yard, but it hadn't been hers then. It had belonged to James' family. James Whitmore. She could still see his mischievous grin, the way he used to tip his cap at her when they met on the sidewalk. The way his deep blue eyes sparkled when he talked about the future. The future he never got to have. Margaret's throat tightened as she stared at the journal. She could feel the boys watching her, waiting for her to say something. Finally, she managed to force words past the lump in her throat. "I knew him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "James Whitmore." Jason's eyes widened. "You did?" Margaret nodded slowly. "He lived here. This was his home before my family bought it." Ryan crouched beside her, glancing at the rusted box. "Do you think he buried this?" Margaret exhaled shakily. "If his name is in that journal, then yes." The past was suddenly so close, as if she could reach out and touch it. She looked at the other items inside the box, the letters, the pocket watch, and a few black and white photographs tucked between the pages of the journal. Margaret carefully lifted one of the photographs. Her breath hitched again. It was James, standing with a few other boys she vaguely remembered. His friends, his brothers in mischief. But there was another figure standing beside him. A girl. "Margaret," she gasped. The boys leaned in. "Is that you?" Ben asked in awe. Margaret nodded slowly. She had to blink several times to keep the tears from spilling over. "I had no idea this was here," she murmured. Jason picked up the bundle of letters. "Maybe these will explain why he buried it?" Margaret hesitated. Did she want to know? Did she want to unearth whatever message James had left behind all those years ago? After a moment, she nodded. "Read it." Jason carefully untied the ribbon and picked the first letter. The paper was delicate, but the ink had survived. He cleared his throat and read aloud. "June 14th, 1943. To whoever finds this. If it's me, well, I hope I remember why I buried it. If it's someone else, I hope they understand what we were fighting for. The war is getting worse. They say more boys from town will be drafted soon. I know I'm next. I can feel it. I don't know if I'll come back, but if I don't, I want a piece of me to stay here. I want someone to remember, and I want Margaret to know." Jason stopped, looking up at Margaret with wide eyes. She felt her breath leave her body. "Go on," she whispered. Jason swallowed and continued. "I want Margaret to know that I love her." The night was silent except for the distant chirping of crickets. The words hung in the air, pressing down on Margaret's chest. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a love that had been buried for over 70 years. James had never come home. She had waited. She had written him letters. She had prayed. But eventually the news had come. His unit had been ambushed overseas. He had died in a foreign land, never knowing that she had loved him too. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. She had spent her whole life trying to move forward, to accept that war had stolen him away. But now, sitting beside his hidden message, she felt like that teenage girl again, heartbroken and waiting. Ryan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he murmured. Margaret took a shaky breath, steadying herself. Then, she lifted her chin. "No," she said softly. This is a gift." She ran her fingers over the letter, her old hands tracing the faded ink. "I spent my whole life wondering if he ever thought of me in those last days. And now I know." Tears finally spilled over, but she didn't fight them. She let them fall, soaking into the past, into the memory of a love that had never faded. And for the first time in decades, she felt at peace. The boys sat quietly watching Margaret as she held the letter in her trembling hands. The weight of the past pressed against her chest, but for the first time in decades, she felt something shift inside her. She exhaled slowly and wiped at her eyes. "There are more letters," she said, her voice steadier now. "I want to read them." Jason hesitated. "Are you sure?" "We don't want to." "I need to," Margaret interrupted. "Please." Jason nodded and picked up another letter from the bundle. He unfolded it carefully, revealing more faded ink. July 2nd, 1943. Dear Margaret, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give you this, but I need to write it down anyway. Tomorrow, I leave for training. They told us we'd be heroes, but all I feel is scared. I'm not scared of fighting, I'm scared of leaving. Leaving you. I should have told you long ago, but I love you, Margaret. I think I've loved you since the first day we met. Do you remember? You were standing on the corner by Miller's soda shop arguing with the owner because he got your order wrong. I thought you were the bravest girl I'd ever seen. I wanted to marry you someday. I wanted to build a home with you, grow old with you, raise a family together. But I don't know if I'll ever get that chance now. If something happens to me, I don't want you to be sad forever. I want you to live, to love, to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted for you. If I don't come back, promise me you'll keep going. Promise me you'll find joy even without me. Forever yours, James. A lump formed in Margaret's throat. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing against her. The boys sat in stunned silence, letting the weight of the words settle. Margaret pressed a hand against her chest, breathing deeply. He never gave this to me, she whispered. I never knew. Ryan's voice was gentle. Maybe he was too scared. Margaret nodded absently, still lost in the past. She thought back to those days, how James had always lingered just a little too long when they said goodbye, how his hand had hovered near hers but never quite touched. She had spent her whole life wondering what if. And now she finally had an answer. She carefully placed the letters back in the rusted box, her hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Then finally broke the silence. What are you going to do with it? Margaret thought for a moment. She could take the box inside, tuck it away somewhere safe, let it collect dust like so many other relics of the past. But no, that wasn't what James would have wanted. I'm going to share his story, she said firmly. James deserves to be remembered. The boys nodded in quiet understanding. Margaret reached out and squeezed Jason's hand, then Ryan's, then Ben's. Thank you, she said softly, for finding this, for helping me remember. The boys smiled, their eyes filled with something more than just excitement now. They had come looking for history, for adventure, but they had found something far more important. And so had Margaret. Margaret sat in the cool night air, staring at the rusted box resting in her lap. The boys had stopped digging, and for a long time, silence filled the yard, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. It was strange, this overwhelming feeling washing over her. It wasn't just grief. No, she had grieved James decades ago. This was something different. A bittersweet relief. A sense of closure she never thought she'd find. The boys remained quiet, as if sensing that she needed time to process. Eventually, Ryan broke the silence. What was he like? He asked softly. Margaret smiled wistfully. James? Oh, he was full of life. She chuckled under her breath, shaking her head. Always getting into trouble, always making everyone laugh. But he was kind too. The kind of boy who would stop everything to help a stranger. Jason leaned forward. Did you love him back? Margaret exhaled. I did, she admitted. I just never got the chance to tell him. Then frowned. Why not? Margaret stared at the old letters, her fingers brushing over the faded ink. Back then, we were young. The war was changing everything. One day, we were kids sneaking into movie theaters and drinking cherry sodas at the diner. The next, boys were getting drafted and everything felt uncertain. I kept waiting for the right moment to tell him how I felt. She looked up, her eyes sad but wise. But war doesn't wait. Ryan sighed. That's not fair. Margaret smiled faintly. Life rarely is. A cool breeze swept through the yard, rustling the pages of James' journal. Margaret reached down and carefully closed the cover. I don't want him to be forgotten, she murmured. He was more than just a name on a memorial wall. He was a son, a friend, and he was mine for a little while. The boys nodded solemnly. Then an idea sparked in Margaret's mind. She looked at the group and asked, Do you boys know where the old war memorial is in town? Jason nodded. Yeah, the one near City Hall. Margaret took a deep breath. Tomorrow, I'd like to go there. I'd like to read James' letters by his name. To honor him. She looked at them with gratitude. And I'd like you boys to come with me. The boys exchanged glances before Ryan grinned. We'd be honored. Margaret smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Maybe she had spent too many years burying the past, thinking it was best left untouched. But tonight had shown her otherwise. Some memories deserved to be unearthed. And some love stories never truly ended. The next morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through her curtains, casting a soft golden glow on her bedroom walls. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a feeling she thought had faded long ago. She dressed carefully, choosing a modest navy blue dress, one she hadn't worn in a long time. It reminded her of the dresses she used to wear in the 1940s, when she and James would walk through town, laughing at nothing in particular. As she pinned her silver hair back, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Time had changed her, but in her heart, she still felt like that young girl standing beside James. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She made her way to the front porch where the four boys stood, looking freshly showered and dressed in their best clothes. Jason held the rusted metal box in his hands. You boys look sharp, Margaret said, smiling warmly. Ryan grinned. Figured we should look nice for James. Margaret's heart swelled with appreciation. Together, they walked to City Hall. It wasn't far, just a few blocks from Margaret's home, but today every step felt significant. People passed them on the sidewalks, some glancing curiously at the old woman walking with 4 young boys. But Margaret didn't mind. When they reached the war memorial, she felt her breath catch. It was a simple structure, polished black granite, standing tall against the sky. Names were etched into its surface, hundreds of them. Young men who had left their small town and never returned. Margaret stepped forward, her fingers trailing over the cool stone until they landed on his name. James Whitmore. Her knees wobbled, but Ryan was there, steadying her with a gentle hand. "Take your time," he murmured. Margaret nodded, swallowing hard. She turned back to the boys. "Let's read his letters," she said. Jason carefully opened the box and pulled out the final letter, the one they hadn't read yet. He unfolded it and cleared his throat. August 5th, 1943. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I never made it home. I don't want you to be sad, darling. If anything, I hope this letter finds you when you've lived a long, beautiful life. I hope you found happiness, love, and adventure. I hope you never let the world make you bitter. But if you do remember me, I want you to remember this: I don't regret loving you. Not for 1 second. I'll always be with you in the laughter of a summer breeze, in the way the sun sets over our little town. And maybe, just maybe, when you look up at the stars at night, you'll know that somewhere I'm looking back at you. Forever yours, James. Margaret felt the tears slide down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. The boys stood in silence, their young faces filled with emotion. Even they understood the weight of the moment. Margaret pressed a trembling hand against the memorial. "I did live a good life, James," she whispered. "But I never forgot you." A breeze swept through, rustling the leaves in the trees, and for a brief moment she could almost hear his laughter. She smiled through her tears. The past had been buried for so long. But today, she had finally unearthed something far greater than an old box. She had unearthed love, memory, and the promise that James had never truly left her. And in that moment, she knew he never would. The 4 boys stood in solemn silence as Margaret traced James Whitmore's name on the memorial. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the weight of years, of lost time, of love left unfinished. Margaret took a deep breath and let it out slowly. It wasn't sorrow she felt now, not entirely. It was something softer, something like peace. Jason carefully placed the rusted box on the stone ledge beneath the memorial. "What do we do with it now?" he asked. Margaret looked down at the letters, the photographs, the tiny remnants of a life that had once been so full of promise. "We tell his story," she said finally. "So he's never forgotten." Ryan's brow furrowed. "How do we do that?" Margaret turned to them with a gentle smile. "By remembering, by sharing what you found, by making sure his name isn't just another one on a wall, but a person. A boy who laughed, who dreamed, who loved." Ben, the quietest of the group, spoke up. "We could talk to the town about putting his story in the museum. There's a section about the soldiers who served." Margaret's eyes brightened. "That's a wonderful idea." Jason nodded. "We could clean up the letters, put them in a display. Maybe even scan them so people can read them." Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. These boys, these wonderful, unexpected young men, had given her something priceless. They had given her the chance to bring James' memory back to life. "I'd like that," she murmured. Ryan grinned. "Then we'll make it happen." Margaret turned back to the memorial, running her fingers over James' name one last time. She didn't need to say goodbye. She had already carried him with her all these years. But now, instead of loss, she felt something else. She felt gratitude. As they turned to leave, the sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the stone. Margaret paused, looking back one last time. And for a brief moment, she swore she could see James standing there, his boyish grin just as she remembered, tipping his cap to her the way he always used to. She smiled. Some love stories never ended. They simply waited to be found again. The days that followed were filled with purpose. Margaret and the boys set to work, determined to ensure James Whitmore's story would not be lost again. Ben and Jason visited the town museum, speaking with the curator, a kind older man named Mr. Donovan, who had spent decades preserving local history. When they told him about James' buried letters, his eyes widened with interest. "You mean to tell me," he said, adjusting his glasses, That a soldier's last words have been sitting beneath that old yard for nearly 80 years? Jason nodded. And we want people to know about them. Mr. Donovan tapped his chin thoughtfully. If you can get me copies of those letters, I'd be happy to create an exhibit. A story like this deserves to be told. Meanwhile, Ryan and Ben worked on scanning the letters and photographs, carefully preserving each fragile page. They typed out James' words so they could be easily read and even reached out to a local journalist who was intrigued by the discovery. Margaret watched it all unfold with quiet amazement. She had spent so much of her life believing the past should remain buried, believing that some wounds never truly healed. But these boys, these kind, determined young souls, had proven her wrong. One afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table with Ryan helping her sort through old photographs, he asked, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Margaret hesitated, looking down at the faded picture of James. "I used to," she admitted. "For a long time, I thought about all the what-ifs. What if I had told him I loved him sooner? What if the war had never happened?" Ryan leaned forward, listening intently. Margaret smiled faintly. "But life doesn't work that way, does it? We don't get to rewrite the past. We only get to honor it." Ryan nodded slowly. "I think James would be proud of you." A lump formed in Margaret's throat, but she nodded. "I hope so." A week later, the museum announced a special event, a dedication to James Whitmore's memory. The exhibit would feature his letters, his journal, and the story of how they were found. The town newspaper picked up the story, and soon, people all over the community were talking about the young soldier who had loved and lost, but whose memory had never truly faded. On the day of the dedication, Margaret stood in the museum, surrounded by faces both familiar and new. She watched as people read James' letters as they murmured softly about the young man who had once walked these same streets. The boys stood proudly beside her. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stepped forward, her heart full. "James Whitmore was more than a name on a memorial," she said. "He was a friend, a son, a boy with dreams of a future he never got to have. But because of these boys, and because of all of you, he is not forgotten." She looked over at the display, at the letters that had been hidden for so long. "For the longest time, I thought love was something that faded with time," she continued. "But I realize now that real love never truly leaves us. It waits. It lingers. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it finds its way back to us." The audience was silent for a long moment before soft applause filled the room. Margaret turned to the boys, eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered. Ryan grinned. "Anytime, Miss Margaret." As the event came to an end, Margaret took one last look at the letters, feeling lighter than she had in years. James' story had finally been told. And with that, she knew her heart had finally found peace. As the weeks passed, the exhibit at the town museum became one of its most visited attractions. People from all over came to read James Whitmore's letters, to learn about the young soldier who had once lived among them. Some left flowers at the memorial, others simply stood in quiet reflection. Margaret visited often. She would sit on the wooden bench near the display and watch as visitors, young and old, absorbed James' words. It amazed her how much impact a single life could have even decades after it had ended. One afternoon, she arrived to find the boys waiting for her. Jason, Ryan, Ben, and Charlie grinned as she approached. "We have something for you," Ryan said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Margaret raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? What have you boys been up to now?" "Just open it," Jason urged, barely containing his excitement. Smiling, she carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a beautifully framed copy of James' first letter, the one where he had confessed his love for her but never had the courage to give it to her. Beneath the letter, the boys had added a simple inscription. "For Margaret, so she'll always know she was loved." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, emotion welling in her chest. "Oh, boys," she whispered, blinking back tears. Ben shifted awkwardly. "We just thought, well, you should have something to keep." Margaret traced her fingers over the glass, over James' familiar handwriting. She looked up at the boys, her heart full. "This means more to me than I can ever say." Ryan scratched the back of his head. "We just figured love like that shouldn't be forgotten." Margaret smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "No, it shouldn't." For the first time in years, she no longer felt the weight of regret pressing on her shoulders. Instead, she felt something lighter, something hopeful. That evening, she placed the framed letter on the small wooden table by her reading chair. It sat beside a picture of her late husband, Robert, a good man who had given her a different kind of love, one that had carried her through the years. She had loved James. She had loved Robert. And now she understood love didn't belong to just one moment in time. It endured. It shaped who we became. It lived on in stories, in memories, in the people who chose to remember. And thanks to 4 curious boys and a buried tin box, James Whitmore's love had finally found its way home. Margaret sat back in her chair, looking out the window as the stars blinked to life in the evening sky. Somewhere out there, she liked to think James was smiling. And for the first time in a long, long while, Margaret Whitmore felt truly at peace.